In every hobby, there are some dirty words that you aren't supposed to say. So today, let's go over the 5 taboo things you were taught not to do that you actually should be. My name's Adam, this is Diamond, you're watching Wickens Reptiles. Stick around. Let's just start off with bare basics, and I'm gonna say that there are differing opinions on some of these things, but I'm gonna try to keep it to what are known facts, have been proven, and of course use my own experience over the last 13 years keeping reptile. 13 years, I'm an artifact. Okay, let's start off with number 5, loose substrate. So, loose substrate is not good for all animals at all stages of life. However, to say that loose substrate is never good for any animal is silly goosery. This just doesn't make any sense. Stop reading care guides from the 1980s. No, your bearded dragon is not going to be impacted if you put them on the correct type of substrate. Now, of course, I wouldn't recommend putting a baby leopard gecko on calcium sand. No. You don't want to do this. They have tiny little organs inside, and sure, there's always a chance of impaction even in the wild, but in the wild, something like, let's switch to a bearded dragon, they're gonna eat things like sticks, because when they go for bugs on natural substrate in the wild, because I don't know if you knew this, there is no tile or paper towel out in the wilds of Australia, or in the wilds of Asia where you find leopard geckos. It's just not a thing. So they're gonna be eating off of loose substrate anyway. And no, I'm not saying that they live in these sandy areas where it's just sand dunes, but they definitely have loose gravel, loose substrate, loose this, loose that, sticks and bugs and the whole thing. And if a bearded dragon is going for a beetle that's on a tiny little branch in a tree that they're in, and they go ahead and grab it, they might break off a piece of that twig and ingest that twig. You're not finding bearded dragons dying of impaction everywhere in the wild. What I will say is don't use things like builder's grade sand, an aggregate that is made to clump together, that has triangular grains of sand. The granules are triangular because they're meant to stick together, because when you put it underneath a patio to lay stone, you don't want it to shift or move. You want it to bind together. If it's a play sand, or say a beach sand, right? That's basically what play sand is emulating. It's round grains of sand that slip and move. So you're not gonna have the issue of impaction if you're doing it correctly and with animals of appropriate size. So this is not my call to arms to switch everything you have onto sand. That's not what I'm saying. There are things that do really great on sand. Dune geckos, for example, you almost need to. Things like knobtail geckos do great on loose substrate even though they're small. Bearded dragons, I would never keep a bearded dragon on anything but loose substrate because it has benefits. For example, I show in this video right here how I make the substrate, but basically it's coconut core and play sand, 50-50 mix, it's dry, and I use that because when Diamond defecates and urinates, right, it kind of clumps together like cat litter and I can scoop it out. So do your research, but the idea that loose substrate is the devil is silly goose stuff. Number 4, cohabitation amongst the same species. Now, this isn't always a good idea. In fact, most times it's not. But the idea that you can never cohab certain animals is wrong. It often comes down to how you're doing it, making sure that you're vetting both of the animals, that they're the same size, maybe they come from the same clutch. You're making sure that you're watching for aggression when you first introduce them. They have a much bigger enclosure than you would keep for one gecko or animal, right? I'm just gonna use geckos as because it's gonna ruffle feathers, right? There's a lot of groups that will say leopard geckos can never ever be cohab for any reason ever. These people are wrong. That is not true at all. Even things like bearded dragons, if they're both females in a huge enclosure, could work. But what most people think is basic math. Okay, well, a bearded dragon needs 120 gallons. If I give it 240 gallons, then it should be okay. Or a leopard gecko needs 20 gallons. If I give them 40 gallons, it should be okay. No, give them more space. If you wanted to put 2 or 3 female leopard geckos in 120 gallons, I think that would be great because they're all gonna have their own hides. They're gonna have their own food dishes and food options. They're gonna have their own areas where they can hide out and be humid if they need to and drink water from the droplets. If you're doing it correctly, you're gonna be able to give them some height so they can move around. But if you wanna do it so that you have a 40-gallon for 2, I just think that probably that's not the best idea because it's not big enough. You need more space, and there's no formula for exactly how much, but just in general, you want to make sure they can be away from each other, for real away from each other, and they're not competing for resources. So multiple hotspots and all that stuff I was just talking about. And then there's animals that do really well in cohab situations. Things like monkey tail skinks, things like garter snakes that thrive and do much better if they're kept together. Sand geckos, dune geckos, whatever you want to call them, right? So there's animals that do much better and almost need to be cohabbed. In my opinion, I would never keep them without cohabbing them. So it just depends on the species. But then there's steadfast rules like bearded dragons. Don't keep a male and a female together all the time. Don't keep two males together ever, because, well, you're gonna wake up in the morning and get them off the side of the glass with a hose one day because they're gonna kill each other. Same thing with leopard geckos. But then there's other animals like dune geckos, I'll bring them up again, where you can keep males together and they never fight. Right? Dart frogs. I know that's not a reptile, it's an amphibian, but it's usually the females that are aggressive towards each other instead of the males. So you just have to know what you're doing. My point is, cohab is not the devil. Number 3, I'm gonna mash a couple together. I'm talking about moving animals to feed outside the enclosure. A lot of people think you need to do this. You don't, I'll explain why. And then varying the diet or not varying it depending on the circumstance. So a lot of people will tell you, you need to vary diet. Doesn't matter if it's a snake, lizard, whatever, you need to vary diet. In some cases, this is a terrible idea. For example, if you want to give, say, hognose snakes, which are notoriously picky feeders, a rat and then a mouse and then an amphibian or a lizard or whatever, I don't recommend doing this. People do, oh, well, in the wilds, that's great. But in captivity, you can get away with just mice. It's more efficient. You know what's going into them, the whole thing. And then a lot of the times, if you go from rat to mouse, they're going to refuse the mouse, or if they like the rat, and then it could go the other way. If you feed things like frogs, well, I mean, of course, make sure they're sourced in the right way. Don't feed them live frogs that you find at your pond. They're amphibian eaters a lot of the time in the wild, so it's going to be hard to get them to go back to mice. In general, feeding mice is a much better option than feeding amphibians because of the content of fats, protein. You want to make sure that you're giving the proper diet. But then the other way, a lot of people say to me, oh, my bearded dragon just eats bugs. I never feed him greens. He doesn't like him anyway. He's doing just fine. No, he's not. Bearded dragons are omnivores. They need to eat greens, also vegetables. You need to feed them things like endive and Swiss chard and whatever, right? There's a whole bunch of them of greens that you can feed. There's a care guide right here for bearded dragons. So you have to do that. And if they're not eating them, vary it up. Give them something else. Maybe try to slip in some bee pollen over top of it. Bearded dragons really, really like bee pollen. It's a great way to get them to eat greens. Feed them things like maybe a little bit of fruit. Not too much, of course, but make it seem like you're giving them more fruit than you actually are by cutting it up and kind of putting it all around so they have no choice but to eat the greens that are kind of hiding the fruit. There are ways to trick your dragon into eating things like that, and I'm just using dragons as an example. It doesn't have to be dragons. Then, quickly, you gotta move your snake, otherwise every time you open the cage, they're gonna think it's food. No, you don't need to move your snake. In fact, for a lot of species, it's more stress. A lot of people will say, if you don't know, you have to take your snake out of the enclosure, put them into a bin, feed them, wait for them to digest it a little bit, and then put them, like, no. Because the same people that say that say you shouldn't handle your snake for 48 hours after you feed them. So, like, this is silly goose stuff. You don't need to do this. You can if you want, but you definitely don't need to. Number 2, this is a quick one, very simple. Aiding in shed. People will tell you that if you have a snake that's in shed, you should never aid them. You should never help them with the shed. If you have a bearded dragon or a leopard gecko that sheds in pieces, you should never help them. This is baloney. Of course, don't prematurely rip off shed that's not ready to go. I'm not saying that at all. But a lot of the times there are snakes, especially bigger ones, that might need help shedding. So if you want to smoothly glide the shed off of that animal, you can do that. If you experience resistance, make sure it's moist, wet it down, don't rip it off. You'll know for sure. This isn't not rocket science. It's very common sense. You'll know what it feels like if you're doing it right or doing it wrong. And then things like bearded dragons, they shed in pieces. So if you feel like there's, flaky bits off of their feet or their mouth or their eyes, yeah, you can gently help them remove it. I'm not gonna spend too much time on this. The whole idea that you can't help your animal shed if it looks like they need help is just silly goose stuff. And number 1, oh, we're gonna ruffle some feathers today. We're talking about multi-species cohab. There are people who will die on this hill. They're wrong. You can definitely keep some species together. There are some species, of course, you wouldn't want to keep together. And a lot of this is common sense, but you should do your research in depth first. This is an advanced level of keeping. So for example, guys like say Troy Goldberg, who had a 300-gallon enclosure and he's keeping multiple species of frogs together, you can do that. He has a huge enclosure, it works, and none of these frogs are gonna prey on each other. And of course, you wanna make sure that if you keep, say, a day gecko with a milk frog, those animals come from similar environments. No, milk frogs are not from Madagascar like the day geckos are. However, Madagascar and South Central America have very similar climates. I've been to both. I can tell you from experience, but you don't need to go there. You've got Google. You can see what the environments are like. So of course, the parameters have to match or be very, very close. I always recommend have, say, a diurnal species with a nocturnal species, so they're not fighting for resources at the same time. Maybe have one that's arboreal and one that is terrestrial, so they're out of each other's space. Have a giant enclosure. And some great examples, of course, do your research. I'm not saying just go willy-nilly throw these together, but some great examples are dart frogs with mourning geckos. But don't put mourning geckos with full-size terribilis, because Philobades terribilis are going to be too big and probably eat the mourning geckos, especially if they're too small. I've even seen people keep dart frogs with, say, the blue cave geckos, the Williams eye. And then if you wanted to get really crazy, I'm planning to do this. I want an 8 foot by 4 foot by 7 foot high or 6 foot high enclosure for a boa constrictor. Boa constrictors are from Central America. You know what else is from Central America? Dart frogs and tree frogs. So if I had dart frogs big enough that they wouldn't be preyed upon by, say, red-eyed tree frogs, and of course none of these are going to be preyed on by the boa because BCIs are too big. They're not going to look at a dart frog and want to eat it. And of course, it's going to be a huge, massive, giant enclosure. This is the dream for me. It's going to sound like a rainforest. It's going to look like a rainforest. It's going to have something big. It's going to have something small or two things small. The dart frogs are hopping around at the bottom during the day. The tree frogs are around at night. The boa is going to be around at night also. And a lot of the time, even in nature, there's pictures of tree frogs sitting on boas. I think this is going to be perfect. Don't bite my ear, Diamond. I thought we were done with this. Why do you do this? Why do you do this? Oh, is it time to wrap it up? Anyway, those are the 5 things I think that are taboo that you've been told you can't do, but you can. So let me know in the comment section below if there's anything else that would fit on this list. And while you're down there, hit the like and subscribe button and let me know your true feelings. Even if you don't agree with me, we can have a productive discussion. And a special thanks to the Patreon supporters. You guys get videos early, discounts on merch. You guys get one-on-ones, all that for as little as $1. And that's it. Because I do videos on Mondays and Thursdays. That means I'll see you in the next one.